All right, so let's dive in and start looking at PBR materials, physically based materials. So there's two inside of here by default that we work with quite a bit. The standard surface shader and the AI standard surface shader. So we're going to talk about both of those. But before we do that, let's go ahead and just get a nice little setup here for our lighting. So let's introduce an Arnold light. You can come up here to Arnold, and let's add in a nice skydome light. We're going to come in here to Lights, skydome here. And we can come into the color and just introduce a quick ramp. For this ramp, feel free to simulate whatever sort of ground you want. Kind of a common setup is to do something neutral for the ground here, maybe a brown earth tone. And then for the sky, we could go ahead and work up to that nice sky blue that the sky tends to have. And then we can even add in some gradation to it. So we could do the darker portion of the sky, which is really high up. You could come in here to the mid portion, which is going to be more of the sky blue we're familiar with. And on the horizon line, we could even push this to be close to white. So that way we get the full range that the sky tends to have, and we can adjust things like the ground placement, the horizon placement, and make that relative to our object's position in the scene. That way we get a feel for how this lighting should look. That's going to give us a nice sort of sense of ambient or environmental light there. This feels a little bit dark, though. I might want to just bump up the value on some of these. That way we're just getting something a bit brighter here than what I currently have. But that should be okay. And let's go ahead and pair that with a directional light to simulate our sun. And with the directional light, I'll go ahead and just bump this over to a nice little yellowish orange color for now. So that way we get a feel for the sun. And we can think of where we might want the shadows to cast. Since this is a hovering character, I might move the ground plane down for the moment. And we can just render this. So I'll come up here to Arnold Render. We can go ahead and see how that renders. And there we go. That's our result. And while we're at it, I might just do a quick view store snapshot here. That way we can store this and have this good to go. So it's been a minute since we talked about materials. If you come into the hypershade here, we can go ahead and click the little ball to pull that up. We can gain access to this, and we can run out of screen space real quick with a renderer plus our viewport plus our menus open. Gets busy quick. Now, just to show you, you can actually do some really interesting stuff with the hypershade. Since you're comfortable with this by now, under the window menu here, you can actually see you can pull up things like your viewport. So you can actually add a viewport and you can dock that somewhere. That way you have access to it. Sometimes I like to do this when working. So you can see now we have that. You can see I can full screen this. I can hit 6. And there we go. You might also notice that you can pull up a render view. So we have a viewport, we have a render view. We could bring up a render view as well. We could place this next to it, and we could go ahead and render. Notice that there are some inconsistencies inside of Maya. This is using the old render style that we looked at in the first project, the Hardware 2.0 one, but it's set to Arnold Render. So you'll see it's the icons there. This is something that Maya's kind of hammering out still. I may have mentioned this previously, but Arnold was not originally the renderer inside of here. The renderer was something called Mentore for a very long time, and the various tools were designed to integrate with that. So this is the reason why I like to show you both, because Maya's still evolving. With that said, we can press this button to get a render out of here and see in our render view. I'll go ahead and transform. I might have to be careful though, because if we have the render view open twice, it may not like that. That's interesting. It's still pulling up this as the render view. Okay, well, maybe we won't be able to use the render view in this particular setup, but that's okay. We can still use the viewport here. That way we have a little bit more screen real estate. And I'll just put the render view over here since we're not going to be able to see it that well anyway. That way we don't have to keep jumping back and forth. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the PBR materials we have access to in here. You'll notice that there is a section here called Arnold, and this is Arnold specific tools. If you had V-Ray installed, you'd have a V-Ray section. If you'd had RenderMan, you'd have a RenderMan section, so on and so forth. And inside of here, you're going to see it has textures, lights, shaders, and utilities. So when it comes to textures, these are different ways we can map the surface of objects, and there's actually some pretty cool ones in here that I sometimes use to bake details from to create my own texture sets. Lights we've already explored, so you can actually access lights through Hypershade. You don't have to access them through the various menus. Shaders, these are special ways to shade the surface, and then utility nodes are special map nodes we can use to modify it. What's important to understand is these work exclusively inside of Arnold and they won't work elsewhere, which also tends to mean our viewport. Traditionally, we would be diving into here and using a lot of these materials for what we're trying to achieve, but since Maya has Arnold integration built in, we can actually use some of Maya's default tools to do the PBR setup. Now, the reason why I want to use Maya's tools is they are the tools I tend to use in my workflow in games. We don't get to render out of Arnold for games unless we're doing promotional pieces or doing something like a cinematic, which isn't very common anymore. A lot of those are done in Game Engine. So generally, we want to preview as much as we can in the viewport, and that's the way I like to work because rendering can take a bit of time, and you'll start to see that as we get more complex projects going. Some of you may already be feeling it if your computer's on the lower end with just a basic scene like this. So where does that leave us? Well, if you come up here to the Maya section and favorites in particular, you'll see that there's something here called the standard surface shader. And if you go into the Arnold section, and you go under shaders, you'll see that the Arnold also has something called an AI standard surface shader. The difference between the AI standard surface shader and the standard surface shader is the standard surface shader works with Hardware 2.0's viewport, whereas the AI standard surface shader does not work as well. Now, what does that mean? Well, they both work, but you won't be able to see certain things in the viewport that you could with the standard surface. The standard surface is newer to Maya. I believe it was added in 2020. So just be aware if you're in an older version, you may not have access to it. But we'll go ahead and start our exploration with that here, creating a standard surface. So as we did in the first project, we can just click that to create a standard surface, and that will add a standard surface shader to our scene. I could then just go ahead and highlight everything, including the round, why not? Right click on that new standard surface and just assign material to selection. Now, when I do that, you're going to notice that our scene changes a bit here. And the reason why is because we now have a standard surface shader applied. So you'll see that we've gained a specular highlight along the surface here, and it also got a little bit later. Now, the standard surface is going to be a lot different than what we've previously looked at. I'm going to go ahead and close out that viewport to just give us a bit more screen real estate here and just pull this up so we can explore this a bit better. When it comes to PBR shaders and these more advanced rendering shaders, what you're going to notice is you're going to have a lot of these subcategories here with little arrows. If you go ahead and collapse these, you'll see there's actually a ton of these. As a matter of fact, I'll do that over here in the attribute editor. And you'll see what each of these are is some sort of facet of how we can change the surface appearance. It gives us a massive amount of control. The idea behind the standard surface shader and why it's called the standard surface shader is it has the ability to simulate any surface. It can do skin, it can do plastic, it can do metal, it can do whatever plants are made out of, you name it, you can simulate it with the standard surface. If you go into the Arnold section, you might notice that there are some very specific shaders like a skin shader, a car paint shader, and that's how things were in the past. You would have very specific shaders for a very specific task. But with the standard surface shader, nowadays we have the ability to really manipulate things and control them with a single shader. This can be very important because a lot of the times when we're creating things like materials, you might have an object that transitions through textures rather than pieces. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're making something like a phone. Well, you might have a metal case, but then it comes forward and has sort of a glass screen with an LED screen underneath it. Now, you could painstakingly model all of those, or you could just create a shape that looks vaguely like a phone. And then through texture maps, you could use things like bump maps to fake the detail. And then you could use guide maps to make areas metallic versus non-metallic, areas specular versus specular, areas transparent versus non-transparent, all that kind of stuff, and do it all with one shader, with one object, with one material. All right. So very powerful what we can do. So let's go ahead and start exploring some of the basic categories here. I'm going to just reassign Lambert 1 to the ground here. So that way we're just affecting the robot. That way we get a little bit more contrast here. Diving in, let's start with base. Base is what is essentially the color section. So you can think of this base as color. What's the difference between the base of a Lambert and the base of this? Not much from our perspective as artists. I'm sure from the background of coding, there's tons of differences, but really it's going to control the color of the surface. Now, one of the things you're going to notice that's new here is something called weight. This is the amount this is being calculated across the surface, and it's kind of a fine-tuning dial that we can use to control the overall contribution this has to the material. So with the base color, you'll see that I can actually set the weight down to 0. And what happens is the color disappears and what we have left is specular. So if you had something that didn't really have a base color, like let's say glass, we could actually set this to 0 on the weight and it won't have any sort of color to it, which is pretty cool. Now we do want color here, so we're going to bring that back up. The color dial works just like the color dial on the Lambert. We can pick a color here. So you can see I can make this a yellow color to contrast with our blue. You can map it with a texture. Works exactly the same. Some new categories we have access to is diffuse roughness. Now, this is one of the really unique things about using PBR materials. They're designed to simulate how light interacts with an object. And when light strikes an object, there's a couple different things that can happen. An object can be specular and it can reflect it. So it can reflect that outward. Another aspect of it is it can absorb it. So it could absorb it inwards. And that's going to be the case with things that are dark. And that would be the idea of maybe setting your weight lower or your color lower. And when it comes to these, it can do these in different ways. So for example, with the reflect, it can do a specular reflection, which is going to be direct in, direct out. And this is going to give you something like a mirror, or it's going to give you a highlight. Or it can do a diffuse reflection. And a diffuse reflection is where it's going to strike the surface, but let's say the surface is a bit rough, that light might bounce around at different angles, and then what's going to happen is it's going to return as a diffuse highlight or a spread out highlight. So the idea behind diffuse roughness is when light strikes the surface, it can either have a direct bounce off or it can have a scattered bounce. Now, roughness is how rough the surface is. So right now it's set to 0, which means it's smooth. If I do a quick view store snapshot here, you can see that we have this nice smooth ball. And if I go and increase roughness all the way, and we go ahead and look at the difference, you'll see that it's not quite as vibrant, not quite as intense. So if I go ahead and store that snapshot and we toggle between these two, you'll see that's what a smooth surface looks like. That's what a diffuse surface looks like. Now, this is only regarding the color hit. So that's the color striking the surface and bouncing around. And when you have high roughness like this is going to be something like concrete. It's going to be something like chalk. What happens there is the light gets very spread. It doesn't bounce back directly. But if we have something that is not rough like this, it's going to be something like a plastic surface or maybe a metal surface. Most surfaces, they tend not to be super rough that we deal with in 3D, but a lot of the times when we're doing more organic work, we'll be here. Now, you don't have to use the extremes. Obviously, we can do between to kind of dial that up and down to find what we like. Notice that I used the idea of specular and diffuse when I was describing it, similar to the reflections we looked at when we explored the Blinn. You'll notice that the specular category has its own roughness, and that's because we can actually have a combination of different materials, and that's one of the cool things about a standard surface. So let's say you had something like concrete, so you have your concrete floor here, right? But let's say you did a plastic sheet of laminate over here. So this here is going to be plastic. This down here is going to be our, rough stone, sort of concrete, whatever's down here. The color property is going to come from this because this is, what's seen. But this plastic here, this might be, clear. It might be transparent. So what happens is you get the surface specular here of this object, the plastic, but you get the color here of the stone. And that's where you would have essentially a diffuse roughness surface paired with a specular reflective surface. So the separation of the channels is intentional there because you can have something that is diffuse in terms of color, but smooth in terms of reflectivity. You could also think of animals that way too. So if you think of something like a salamander or a shark or a frog, what happens if you dry out a frog or a salamander? They're not that shiny, right? Their body's secreting fluids. What happens if you let a shark sit out of the water for a while? That's another case where, you might use a diffuse roughness on their skin, but pair them with a specular. Now, a unique dial that we gain access to is going to be metalness here. Let me set my diffuse roughness down. And this is really one of the groundbreaking changes with the PBR workflow is the ability to accurately capture metal. So when I go ahead and crank up the metalness here, you'll see my object magically looks like it is made out of metal. It went from being some plastic thing to looking a bit like gold. This changes the algorithm of how light strikes the surface, and it differentiates between what is an insulator and what is a conductor. All right. So when we talk about things like insulators, well-known one is, things like rubber. You got those good old rubber gloves and boots so you can wrangle your Pikachus. Insulators are going to keep electricity out. So when electricity comes, let me go ahead and make little electrical signals. These insulators are going to block it. And that's the idea behind insulators. Most things that we encounter tend to fall into the category of insulators. So if we're talking about rubber, that's an excellent example of an insulator. But, most plastics are going to be insulators. They're essentially not going to let that in, is the idea. But let's take a look at something like a conductor. Good old fashioned, thunder rod and the thunderstorm, right? The thunder comes down, strikes the rod. What happens with conductors is that they don't block electricity. They let electricity move through them. All right. So they basically absorb it, if you will. And that's going to be what the metalness kind of deals with, is whether or not something conducts electricity, whether or not something insulates electricity. And it's going to change its specular property. Now, why is this significant? Well, when you think about light is two things. It is both energy and it is a particle, right? Or correction, it's a particle and a wave. There we go. Wave's the word I'm going for. And wave is what we're dealing with here. It's the property of light as a wave. Waves can travel through things. They can also bounce off of things. So we're thinking of it as that sort of electricity, right? It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So it's important to understand light as energy. And that's what metalness is going to deal with here. If you want it to look metal, you can crank that up. Also notice we can have partial levels of metalness, which can come into play if you have things like corrosion, for example. Things might not be perfectly metallic either. For example, a lot of metals are mixed with other materials, a lot of impurities. So the pureness of the metal can be an effector of how much we use. Okay, so that's going to deal with the base. Now, the next one we're going to care about is going to be things like specular, because that's going to adjust how the surface works. You have weight. Obviously, you can actually remove specularity entirely here. This turns it into a Lambert. So once you have the weight gone, this is officially a Lambert. We tend not to do that. You have specular color. It works the same way as specular color on Lambert, so you can adjust and control the actual specular color. So let's say I wanted this to have a blue reflection. I could make the reflection blue, or maybe green, so that way we can see it. Red. None of these really work with our lighting setup. General rule, this stays white. Just be aware of that. Some new dials we have access to is roughness. If I go ahead and play around with the roughness here, you'll see as I increase it, the highlight appears to go away. But what really happens there is it spreads out. Now, this is very useful to know for surfaces like concrete or asphalt. Hard surfaces we tend to make the ground out of, at least. And for those of you who have ever caught a sunset or tangent lighting to the concrete or the asphalt, you might notice it actually is very shiny. And that's because it does have a specular property, but that specular property is diffuse. So the only time you see it is when the light is tangent to the surface. So it's important to understand that if we're going to create something like concrete or cement and make it realistic, it does actually have specularity. We wouldn't want to come in here and crank the weight down. What we'd want to do is we'd want to crank the roughness up to 1. Okay. Likewise, roughness can go down to 0. This makes it a perfect reflection. And we can't really see it here so much, but you'll see if I zoom in, you'll see how this little highlight is occurring in this area, which is a mirror-like reflection from this object onto this object. So when we set that down to 0, we're essentially getting a mirror-like reflection. We generally have it somewhere in the middle. It varies per object. We'll go ahead and set this 2.5 for now. We have other factors like the IOR, which is the index of refraction. We'll talk about that a bit later on, but that deals with the bending of light, and every type of material has a different index of refraction. You have anisotropy, which is the bending of light. We won't be able to see that very well here, but this is going to be the effect on things like CDs or silk surfaces, where you get a highlight that follows a curve. And let me see if I can make this more apparent here for us. Okay, so you'll see as I introduce anisotropy, it's going to make that follow the curvature of the object. So you can see the roundness is going to be what it's following there. And it's kind of hard to see from here. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit, but you can see that little halo there. And you can actually see it really well in our viewport. This is why I like to use the standard surface shader, because it does have that compatibility in the viewport. It actually looks better in our viewport than it does here, which is surprising. We'll explore why later on, but you'll see that it gives us that curvature like we would see with the CD disc. This also follows any sort of cloth surface. So a lot of the times, if you've ever seen like a cloth Christmas ornament, it will follow this directionality, realizing that both of these are relics of the past, CDs and cloth ornaments. But yeah, that's going to be anisotropic. You'll also see it with things like silk. Rotation will let us change the angle of the anisotropic. So it's going to allow us to change it to follow in the curvature of whatever that is. Anisotropics are pretty rare, honestly. So yeah, it's there if we need it. So let's go ahead and delve into some of the other categories just so you know what to expect. Transmission is the ability of light to travel through an object. So when we talk about the word trans, it means to change or to go from one place to another. So for example, transit, if we're talking about things like trains, or just getting around. If you crank up the transmission, you'll see it will turn this into a clear surface that looks a bit like glass, or in this case, it's going to look maybe similar to water almost with our current background. But you'll see that it looks a lot better than when we used transparency previously. It actually looks like a glass surface, which is pretty cool. So that's one of the other aspects of rendering here, and that's going to be dealing with refraction. In particular, refraction is the bending of light as it travels through a medium. Okay, so that's going to be what we're seeing in this area here in particular, is the sky from up here is actually being bent around to the bottom here. And that's going to be what makes it like glass. Now you can use the index of refraction to adjust this. 1.52 is essentially glass. If we set this to 1.33, I believe that's going to make it look a bit more like water. If you set it to 0, it will actually remove the refraction altogether, and you'll just have a reflection. If you set it to something like 2.5, that's going to be something like a diamond. So you'll see that the index of refraction really starts to come into play when you are dealing with transparencies. Now, in addition to that, though, let me set this back to 1.5. It's important to understand that specular reflection also affects the transmission. So transmission and specular are directly linked. If I adjust things like the roughness here, you'll see that it affects the roughness of the transmission, and this can be useful for something like a frosted glass or maybe a gel-like surface. If we reduce the reflection there, you can see that you can get something even more pure glass-like and get no reflection, but generally most glass surfaces have a little bit of roughness. So that will affect that there. Anisotropy will only affect the highlights really, but it does show up in the refraction as well. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's get that back to 1.5, get the anisotropy off there. And that's going to be transmission. Now, you'll notice there are all sorts of dials in here to affect transmission. We're going to explore those later on. What I want to do is just kind of introduce you to the idea of how these work. And we're going to touch primarily on the base and specular, since that's going to be where we begin. However, I do want to introduce a couple other categories here just so you can see them. Subsurface is going to be the ability of light to travel through a surface, and that's going to be for surfaces like skin or for surfaces like wax. If we go ahead and increase the weight there, you'll see it's not quite like transparency, but you'll see now that the object almost goes gel-like and light's traveling through it. Subsurface is one of the most complex aspects of 3D to master when it comes to rendering. It's very hard to calculate, but it also is different from software package to software package. I find Arnold's is a bit hard to work with, but something important to understand is the scale concept. This is how much the light travels through, or at least the scale of the object. Right now, it's traveling straight through it since we have this at 1 and we're just using default units. If I set this to something like 0.01, you'd see we would get a very different result here. The other thing to be aware of is notice it cancels out base color. If I adjust the base color here, it's not really affecting it at all. It kind of overrides it if we set it all the way. But if I were to just set it partially here, you'll see it just kind of changes where the light penetrates. So we can actually make some pretty cool effects with things like subsurface scattering here. We'll get into that later. It's a very complex shader, but we have access to that. Coat is kind of a neat one. If you increase coat, it gives you a secondary specular channel across the surface. So that's going to be what coat is going to give us access to. And that can be useful when we have complex things going on or we need to drive the specular differently than the coat. So those are useful. Sheen is going to be useful for making cloth. That's going to add this sort of outer halo to the surface, add a sort of softness to things. Emission can be used to glow. Emission is the same thing as incandescence when it comes to the Lambert or the blend shader. So you'll see that as we increase that, we can make this glow a different color. We can change the light color to glow whatever we want it to glow, which is going to be very useful for our robot. Thin film, that will allow you to add sort of a thin film effect to it. Okay. And then lastly, geometry, we'll play around with that later. But that's going to be a base rundown. So what are we going to care about in this particular project? We're going to start with base and specular because this is going to be what we use 90% of the time. And then also some emission. So that way we can add emitted light. As we progress through the course, we might delve into some of the other ones, such as sheen when we get into creating interiors, and maybe some subsurface when we get into organic characters later on. But that is going to be the PBR materials. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is try and create two materials here. With one material, make the ball joints of the robot look like they're made out of metal, and with the other, make the cylinders look like they're made out of plastic. So that way you have two variations. So go ahead and try that on your own now that I've shown you the base controls. And when you come back, we'll go ahead and do it together. So go ahead and pause here, try it on your own, and then when you're done, come back and I'll take you through the process. All right, so welcome back. Let's go ahead and set this up. So let's go ahead and start by just making this standard material maybe look like our plastic. The first thing I'm going to need to do is do a base color here and go ahead and find ourselves a nice Macintosh white. I don't know why they always like white robots these days. I might go ahead and bias it a little bit towards gray and maybe even just push it a little bit towards blue or green, maybe. Give it a nice sci-fi look. I know our lighting's already very blue in the scene. I might want to change that up in my sky dome. So let me go ahead and click on my sky dome light here. We'll just click this little arrow here. If you're ever dealing with things that have plugins, you can click this arrow to get to the ramp. And I'm just going to desaturate that a bit so that it doesn't look quite as dramatic blue as what we have. So let's just pull these back because my goodness, is this scene blue. All right, so just pull back those saturations. All right, now we have a nice white looking character. We can come back into that standard surface here. We can maybe give it a little bit of roughness, not a whole lot. Maybe I'll do something like 0.2, 0.3. Under the specular, we can make sure it has some weight here. And with the roughness, since it's plastic, let's set it a bit higher. And I'll base it off of the middle portion of the sphere here. So that way I have a better idea of how that highlight's kind of hitting. Maybe something like 0.5 would work out okay. That's pretty much all we need to do for something like plastic. I might take this down a little bit lower, like 0.3. That way it's still maintaining that highlight. And we're good. We can go ahead and name this. I'll just make this our plastic underscore material. And then we can come in and we can try out some metals. So what I can do is select all the joints in the scene. I'm going to select 1, 2, 3, and then come around to the other side. And I'm holding shift the whole time I'm doing this, just shift clicking. And then we can just do the same way we've done before. We can right click, assign new material. And in here, we could just click the standard surface, and that will assign a new standard surface to that. You'll notice that looks a bit different in our viewport. It doesn't have that little blue we added into the plastic material, which makes me think maybe I want to tone that blue down just a bit. That's quite saturated, I guess. But with our new standard surface, I can name this metal underscore material. We can go ahead and introduce a color. Now, this poses an interesting question. What color are metals? Well, it depends on the type of metal. Obviously, if it's gold, it's going to be a gold color. Most irons and steels are going to lean towards blue. So if you're doing like a stylized one for something like a video game, you might use a range like this, a nice blue-gray. That'd be fine. So we could go ahead and introduce that and then just crank up the metalness there all the way. I don't really like how that's looking, though. Surprisingly, it should have taken on a bit more color. So I might play around with that, maybe sample some different colors here to make this look more metallic. I think I'll go lighter on this one. And then we can come down here and play around with things like the roughness. So we can make it a rough metal. Maybe they've been rotated a lot. We can make it a more glossy metal, which makes it look like it doesn't move at all. I think I'd make mine a little bit rougher there, and that would give us some differentiation between plastic and metal there. Not really that noticeable, but it's a start. Looks better than nothing. Maybe I'll go ahead and tone that down a little bit more to make it more metallic. Okay, so now you can see we're using that PBR material there. We're getting something a little bit different between plastic, between metals, and making our character have a little bit more life. All right. So hopefully that gives you a good rundown there on just the basics of these materials, how they work.